Today's daf is daf Kuf Yud Tes, and we'll start where we left off yesterday on Kuf Yud Ches Amid Beis. Omar Rav, which is approximately 8 lines up from the bottom, Ein Yad Lepachos Mikizayis. So a Yad which is going to transmit Tuma would only apply if the Ochel itself has a Kizayis. But if the Ochel is less than a Kizayis, then the Yad is not a Yad to transmit tuma. V'ein shomer lepachos mikipul, and the minimum amount of food in order to establish a halach of a shomer, which protects the food, has to be at least a minimum of a pull. Pull is a large bean. It's smaller than a kazayas, but it's larger than a small bean. It's kind of like a middle size volume. And according to Rav, if a food is smaller than the volume of a large bean, then it has no chashivus, and it cannot have a shomer. The shomer is not a shomer unless the pull of the, let's say, the food is the size of a large bean, which again, as we said before, is less than a kizayis. So the minimum shear for a yad is a kizayis, but for a shomer, it's a kipul. He gives here an example. If a small bone containing less than a kipul of marrow, right? The ochel is inside the bone, and the bone itself is a shomer to protect the marrow inside the bone. And let's say that this small bone that has less than a kipul of marrow is together with other foods that measure together with that small bone a kibetza. The volume of the bone, which again the bone is the shomer, may not be included in the kibetza measurement. Why? Because it is not protecting a marrow the size of a kipul. The same applies to lentils in a pod, right? The pod protects the lentils. When the lentils do not add up to a kapul, the pod does not have the status of a shomer, and it cannot, number one, be mitztarif, and number two, it cannot be that vehicle to transmit tumah. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Amar yesh yad lepachos mikazayis v'yesh shomer lepachos mikapul. That even if the food is less than a kizayis, nevertheless there is the status of a yad. And even if the food is less than a large bean in its volume, nevertheless it is a shomer, meisvei. Now the Gemara is going to challenge Rav from a brisa. Shtei atzamos valeim. Okay, so now we're dealing with olos, meaning with the laws of roof tumah. And we're talking about bones from a corpse, which, if they would have the size of a kizayis, then that would make the oel into an oel of a mess. But here we have a case where you have two bones from a dead body. Each one does not have enough flesh on it in and of itself to be metami v'tumas ochlin. Because if you look at each one of these bones, all you have in terms of flesh from the deceased is a half a zayis. Now, where are these two bones? So there's let's call it the top of the bone and the bottom of the bone. So hichnis rasheim hashniim labayis. Okay, so one end of these two bones is inside the house. However, the tips of the bones, which have flesh inside attached to them, are outside the body. So now the question is whether or not we could view the part of the bone that doesn't really directly protect the flesh as if it were a yad or a shomer, such that now, if it would be a yad or a shomer, then even though each bone individually is attached to less than a kazayas worth of basar, nevertheless, it could be that we could be metame. So what's the deal in this case? So we have habayis mal. According to the Tanakama, habayis tame. Anything in the house is tame, and that's based on the assumption that since a kazayas of a mess will create a tumas ohel for anything else inside the house, and now we have a bare bone, right? A bare bone is not metame ba'ohel. It's got to be flesh. Again, there are other tumas that you can contaminate yourself with from a corpse, even in a bone that is bare, meaning bare of any flesh. But when a bone has flesh attached to it, the bone transmits tuma through oil. The bone is a yad for the flesh, because if you lift up the bone, you will mamela lift up the marrow. I shouldn't say marrow, I should say the flesh that's attached to the bone. So now, if the bone is underneath a roof and part of the bone that has flesh is outside the roof, outside the ohel, nevertheless, since the bone is considered a yad, therefore it's as if, right, and a yad can lachnis tuma, therefore through the yad, the two half a zasim of flesh will integrate to form a full kizayis. That's the sheet of the Tanakama. However, Yehuda ben Nuksa Omer Mishum Rabbi Yaakov Heich Shnei Atzomos Mitztarfim LeKizayis. Right, in order to generate a tumas oil, you need a kizayis worth of basar, and each one of these atzomos is only connected to a half a zayis of basar. So now the Gemara is going to ask a kash on Rav, and that is the following. The Rav, here on the top of Kuf Yud Tes, Hai b'mai okimle. What are we talking about here in this machlokes between Tanakama and Rav Yehuda? Are we talking about a yad, or are we talking about a shomer? Right? Because again, neither bone contains marrow, but they have a half a zayis of flesh attached to it, but that half a zayis of flesh is outside the oil. So ibiyad kasha reisha, the word reisha here means the Tanakama. The Tanakama says that the oil is tame. How could that be? According to Rav, you need a kazayis worth of flesh in order for the yad to qualify as a yad. Ibe shomer, let's say that the subject of this machlokes and this brisa is shomer, is then kasha seifa. I don't understand Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the house is tar, because he's maintaining that a bone that contains half a zayis of flesh cannot bring tuma into the house. But if we're talking about a shomer, then why is there no shomer here? It's got to be because it's only half a zayis. But in the case of a shomer, Rav had ruled that even a kipul would be enough to establish a shomer and therefore transmit the tumah. So Gemara says there are two ways of answering this. Iboy same according to one way b'shomer, and Iboy same b'yad. Iboy same b'yad. Actually, there's a girsa problem. It should say Iboy same b'yad and then Iboy same b'shomer. Anyway, Iboy same b'yad. If the price is referring to yad, and then we had trouble with the shita of Chachamim. So you know what? Who, meaning Rav, Di Omar, Kirab Yehuda, that's fine. Right? The house is tar because the yad is not a yad of a kizayis, of basar, and Rav sides with Yehuda. And that's fine. Ibai same b'shomer, and who Di Omar Ketanakama. If you're going to tell me that we're dealing with a shomer, which means that all you need in terms of the volume of flesh is only that of kipul, therefore the house is tameh b'toras shomer. But now the Gemara says, wait a minute, has Rabbi Yochanan going to interpret this price? Rabbi Yochanan Omar kula b'yad. He's going to say that the price is dealing with a yad, and therefore the house should be tameh. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, you don't need a kizayis for yad. For Hudiyama Kitanakama, and Rabbi Yochanan therefore will have to insist that we paskin like the Tanakam against Yehuda, which the Gemara holds as dachuk. It's not really the way we want to go, because Rabbi Yehuda paskin that the bais is tar. Now, if we're dealing with a yad, so then the bais has to be tame, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, you don't need a kizayis for yad. Toshma. Now we have a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kulis. Okay, kulis is a certain bone in the thigh of an animal, and yesh aleha kizayis basar. Now, what kind of tumor are we dealing with here? L'chora, we're dealing with an animal that was shechted, and the meat itself is therefore a foodstuff. It's an ochel, and now we need a kizayis of basar combined with other foods that all told measure a kibetza, which is the minimum shear for tumas ochlin. And Rabbi Yehuda says that if the kulis has a kizayis basar, then goreres kula letuma, which means that the flesh makes the entire bone fit to acquire tuma. It drags its entirety towards tuma. If the kizayis of flesh, as we said before, would combine with other foods and measure kibetza, then once there's a source of tumah that touches any part of the bone, the food becomes tameh. Acherim omrim, others say, afilu ein oleh ela kipul. You don't have to stipulate the condition that yesh oleh kizayis. Let's say it doesn't have a kizayis. All it has in terms of the volume of flesh is that of a large bean. Kipul is gogeres tuma, kula l'tuma. Now, so far, this sounds very good according to Rabbi Yochanan. But the Gemara says, V'Rav, hi b'mai ukimle. How will Rav interpret this brisa? Otherwise, he's going to be contradicted. Why? Because ibiyad is kasha seifa. Then we have a problem with the acherim who say that even though it only has a kapul, and according to Rav, the minimum volume for a yad is kizayis, so how can you square with acherim? And ikishomer, if we're dealing with a case of the thigh bone that protects the flesh, and if it's a shomer, is kasher reisha. I don't understand Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you need a kizayis, because even Rav, who requires a kizayis, that's only for yad, but not for a shomer. As far as the shomer is concerned, it's kipul. So once again, the Gemara is going to try to work this out in both ways. Ibai saying biyad, okay, so who the Yomer Rabbi Yehuda? Ibai saying b'shomer, or I could say that the price is dealing with a shomer ke'acheren, and Rav and his ruling would reconcile, or shall we say, would express itself in the sheet of the Chachamim. And as far as the shomer is concerned, all you need is the size of a pool. Now, why do you need a size of a pool if we're dealing with a shomer according to Rabbi Yochanan? Because Rabbi Yochanan Amar kula b'shomer. If we're dealing with a shomer who domer chachamim, and therefore a shomer, even if it's less than a large bean volume, is metame. But the Gemara asks acherim hakapul ka'amri. Again, the acherim are willing to lower the volume of flesh from a kizayis to a kapul, but they nevertheless require a pull. Rabbi Yochanan said even less than a pull of flesh qualifies for shomer. So the Gemara says no. The Chacham didn't really mean that you need at least the size of a large pool. It's Idi, the old literary integrity here. Idi the Komatana Kama Shiura is Ka'amri Inu Nami Shiura. The Acherim also mentioned that shear of a large beam, whereas in order to sort of parallel or continue with the line of reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that the shear is that of a kizayis, because he was learning it's not a shomer, it's only a yad. Amar Rav Dekanami, I also want to read the Brisa meticulously and support the shita or the explanation that we're talking about a shomer, the katani kulis, right? We specifically were taught in this Brisa about a thigh bone, which has marrow, and the marrow is protected by the bone. Shmamina. Okay. Itmar. Now, we're dealing with the Acherim, who mentioned that you need the volume of a large bean. Rabbi Chanina Omar, Zeu Shir. In other words, let's take the Acherim literally at face value, and the minimum volume in order for this shomer to have the status of a shomer, according to Acherim, is a large bean's volume. But Rabbi Yochanan Omer ain't zeshir, right? And again, we're going to go through the same shakla v'tarya. What do you mean ain't zeshir? V'aktani kipul. I did the call martana kama shiura ka'amri ihu inu nami shiura. Actually, any amount of flesh makes the bone a shomer that would acquire tumah under the status of shomer, and you don't even need the size of a large pool, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Toshma, another objection to Rav from a Mishnah in Uktzin. Okay, so the Gemara here doesn't print the Reisha, the first initial part of the Mishnah, and it's talking about peas in a pod or beans in a pod. The pod itself is called a sharbit. And the sharbit is susceptible to tumah as long as the pod has beans in it. But let's say you empty the pod of its beans, right? I don't know if you eat edamames, but what you do is you squeeze out the beans. So you squeeze out all the beans and you're left with the pod. Then it's not metame unless you left one single bean inside. Rabbi Lazar is already metar b'shel pool. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, on the other hand, the sharbit, since it, in its natural state, contains within it large beans, now you emptied the large beans, what you're left with is some sort of small bean, then it's tar. However, if you have a sharbit, which means a pod, bishal kitnis, which is a small bean, then it is tameh. Why? If it's such a small bean, well, what status does it have as a shomer? And the Brisa says when they shirotze bimash mishon, right? He doesn't want to handle directly these small beans. He'd rather handle the sharbitim, and then nobody touched the beans. But in any event, the bottom line is this is against Rav, because we're talking about a shomer, and Rav said that the smallest volume of a shomer has to be that of a kipul, large bean. And yet here we're saying that even a small single bean qualifies as a shomer, and the pod becomes a shomer to transmit tumah. So where it says Kida Omar Rav Acha Breder Rava in a different context, which we'll soon see what context, Bekulcha umishum yad. We're not dealing with a shomer, as we assumed until now. We're dealing with a yad. And the metzius, the reality here, is that I guess you have many pods that come out of a stem. The stem is called the kulcha. The stem is a yad. You just lift up the stem, and all the pods with their beans inside get lifted up. So therefore, this kilcha, did I pronounce it right? This kulcha, sorry, which is the stem, is mekabel tuma because it's a yad. The stem is able to deliver tumah to the beans like a yad. So if a source of tumah touches the stem, the beans are contaminated. The mekabel tumah. The stem is a yad for more than a kizayis, which according to Rav, that's the smallest minimum measure that qualifies for a yad. Each stem has numerous pods attached to it. Thus, if each pod contains only a single bean, but the beans in total measure more than a kizayis. And since the stem is a yad, according to Rav, you need that it be a yad for food that has the minimum size of a kizayis. Again, we're talking about small beans because, as I said, we don't want to handle the small beans directly. Toshma, another objection to Rav from a brisa. The Tana debate Rabbi Yishmael al kol zera zerua asher yizora. And this we had already back on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin. Kiderech shebnei adam otziim, right? When you take out various kinds of grains or kernels to plant them, then what's the kiderech, the normal way that you take them out? Chita beklipasa, the wheat in its husk. Saor beklipasa, adashim beklipasa, right? Barley in their husk. Adashim, which are lentils in the husk. This is the source of the law of shomer, because the husk is a shomer to protect the barley or wheat or lentils. So the husk is a shomer. And now we said it's mitztaref to get the measure of tumah, which in the case of ochlin is kibetza. So even a lentil, which is much smaller than a large bean, qualifies as a shomer. And yet Rav says that a shomer is only if you have food the size of a large bean. How do you explain lentils? And the Gemara answers, Birya shiny, since these lentils are in their natural state, the way they were created, they have a certain chashivus, and therefore they can qualify to have a husk, meaning that's the way you find wheat and lentils and barley in the natural state, and therefore you have a shomer, even if the wheat, etc., is not the volume of a large bean. And we're up to Boyer of Oshir.